The clasp would not close. Eliza pressed her thumb against the small silver hook at the back of her neck and counted 1, 2, 3. And on 3 it slipped into its eye with a soft click that sounded, in the quiet of the attic room, like a door being shut on a different life. Below her, the carriage was already in the yard. She could hear the horses shifting, the coachman murmuring to them in that low, patient voice men use with animals and with frightened girls, and somewhere further off, in the front hall, her aunt's voice rising and falling in the particular cadence that meant she was being kept waiting and intended everyone to know it. Eliza did not hurry. She stood very still in front of the speckled glass and looked at the dress. It was not new. Anyone who knew anything about dresses would see that in a glance, and tonight everyone would know something about dresses. The silk had been the color of cream once, the kind of cream that pools at the top of a jug on a cold morning, and in the candlelight it was almost that color still. If you did not look too closely at the hem, where time had bruised it to the faintest shade of tea. There were 3 places along the bodice where she had set tiny, almost invisible stitches over the last fortnight, each one taken in the hour after the household had gone to sleep, by the light of a tallow stub that smoked and would not stay steady. There was a 4th place at the inside of the left sleeve, where she had given up trying to make the mending invisible and had simply made it neat, because no one was going to lift her arm and look. She hoped no one was going to lift her arm and look. She set the thought aside. Her mother had worn this dress exactly twice. Eliza knew this the way she knew her own pulse, because her mother had told her, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a narrow room, when Eliza was 8, and her mother was already thinner than a woman of 31 ought to be. Twice, her mother had said, smoothing the silk across her knees as if it were a sleeping cat. Once at the assembly the spring I was 19, and once the night your father came back from the north and asked me a question I did not expect. You will wear it, her mother had said, when you have a night that matters. And Eliza had nodded then with the solemnity of a child being given a key to a door she could not yet see. And her mother had folded the dress carefully into a lined chest, and that was the end of the matter for a long while. Tonight was the night that mattered, because tonight was the only night that was likely to come. Her aunt had made that part very clear. The invitation was a courtesy, extended at the whim of a hostess who could afford whims, and it would not be extended again. There were 6 unmarried girls in the parish of any standing at all, and Eliza was at the back of that small queue by every measure that the parish bothered to measure. She had no fortune. She had no father living. She had no protector beyond an aunt who had taken her in the way one takes in a cat that has begun to look pitiful on the step, with grumbling and a saucer of milk and the firm understanding that the arrangement is provisional. She had, instead, the dress. She had her mother's 2 nights folded into the silk like a pressed flower. She had a careful, mended seam at the inside of her left sleeve. She had, she thought, a kind of quiet that other girls did not have, and she did not yet know whether that quiet was a strength or only what was left of her after everything else had been taken away. She picked up the gloves. They were her aunt's. They were a half size too large, and the kid had yellowed at the fingertips in a way that no amount of chalk would mend, and she drew them on and smoothed them up to the elbow with the deliberation of a soldier fastening a buckle. In the glass, her face above the cream silk looked very young and very composed, and she did not recognize either of those things in herself, and decided not to think about that either. There was a great deal she had decided not to think about tonight. She had made a small ledger of these refusals in her head over the past 3 days, the way a careful housekeeper marks down what cannot be replaced and what must simply be lived with, and she was going down the stairs now with the ledger closed. Her aunt was in the hall with her hand on the newel post and her chin lifted to that angle, which meant she had already composed the first sentence of her displeasure and was holding it in her mouth like a sweet. And when Eliza appeared at the bend of the stair, her aunt forgot the sentence and stared. For a long second, she did not speak at all. Then she said, in a voice that had gone surprisingly quiet, "Oh, child." And then, because she was who she was, she remembered herself, and the sweetness in her mouth turned acid again, and she said, "Well, it will have to do, will it not? We have not the means to make it otherwise. And do try, please, not to be noticed in any particular way." Eliza inclined her head. She did not say what she might have said, which was that she had no intention of being noticed in any way at all, and that this dress was for being seen by a woman who could not see her anymore, and not for being seen by any of the women who would be looking tonight. She only said, "Yes, Aunt." She said it the way she said most things to her aunt, evenly, with the smallest possible surface for the words to catch on, and her aunt sighed and pulled on her own gloves and said, "Come." The carriage smelled of old leather and someone else's perfume, a heavy violet that did not belong to her aunt, and that Eliza guessed had been borrowed along with the carriage from a neighbor who had not herself been invited, and who wished, in this small way, to attend. The lanes were dark already. The hedges flicked past in shapes that looked, at this hour, like crouching animals, and Eliza watched them and listened to the rhythm of the horses and tried to make her breath match it. She had not been to a ball. She had been to 2 assemblies in the village hall, where the floor was uneven and the music had been a fiddle and a borrowed pianoforte, and the punch had tasted of pears that had been a little turned. And she had stood at the edge of the room both times and counted the panes in the windows to keep her face quiet. Tonight there would be a great many panes. She could already, in her mind, see them. She did not know yet about the Duke. That is to say, she knew of him, the way one knows of weather in another county. She knew that the house they were driving toward was his, and that he had inherited it the year before from a cousin who had died young and unexpectedly, and that he had taken up residence in it with a quietness that the neighborhood had not yet decided how to interpret. Her aunt had decided, of course. Her aunt had decided several things, none of them flattering, and had repeated them at breakfast for a week. He was proud, her aunt said. He was particular. He had refused 2 introductions already. He had a face, her aunt added with the air of one delivering a verdict that suggested he did not intend to make himself agreeable. Eliza had nodded over her tea and noted the verdict in the ledger of things she had decided not to think about, and now, as the carriage turned in at the gates and the long drive opened before them in a chain of small fires set in iron baskets, the verdict came back to her, and she set it aside again. The house, when it came into view, was lit from within as if someone had taken the trouble to set a candle in every window, and the candles together made the stone look soft, almost living, almost as if the building were leaning a little toward the drive in welcome. She did not believe in the welcome. She knew, as the carriage rolled the last 100 yards over the gravel, exactly what she was, and exactly what she would look like to anyone who counted such things, and she folded her hands in their yellowed gloves in her lap and waited for the door to open and for the night to begin. The footman at the carriage door had a face trained to give nothing away, and he gave her nothing as he handed her down, which she counted, privately, as a kindness. The steps up to the hall were broad and shallow and very clean, and at the top of them a second footman took her cloak, and a third indicated the way. And in a corridor lined with paintings of horses and of men who had owned horses, she walked beside her aunt with her chin at the angle her mother had taught her, neither high nor low. As if the angle of one's chin were a small flag one could choose to fly without making a speech. From the far end of the corridor came the sound of music. It was not a fiddle. It was a great many instruments at once, breathing together, and underneath the music there was the low river sound of 100 voices speaking in a room with a high ceiling. And Eliza felt, for the first time that evening, her composure slip half an inch, and she pressed the inside of her left wrist with the gloved thumb of her right hand, the way her mother used to do when she was nervous, and the composure settled back into place. They were announced. The names were given to a man in livery at the door, and the man in livery gave them in turn to the room. And the room did what rooms do when a name it does not know is offered to it, which is to pause for half a heartbeat and then resume, with a very small alteration in its pitch. Eliza stepped through the doorway and into the light, and she did not look at any one face in particular, because she had learned long ago that the trick to walking into a room was to look at the room itself, the cornices, the chandeliers, the pattern of the inlaid floor, as if one had come to admire the building and was indifferent to its inhabitants. She admired the cornices. She admired the chandeliers, which were 3, and which were enormous, and which held, she counted without meaning to, somewhere near 200 candles between them. She admired the floor. She moved along the wall to the place her aunt indicated, which was beside a tall window where a cluster of older women were already settled with their fans, and she stood, and she waited, and she did what one does at a ball when one is not yet certain that one has been correctly delivered to it, which is to listen. The first whisper came within the minute. She could not have told anyone afterward who began it, only that it began on her right and traveled in a slow arc behind her, low and busy, and she felt it as a small change in temperature at the back of her neck. "Did you see?" the whisper said. "Did you see the sleeve? Did you see the cut? That bodice has not been new these 20 years. Oh, poor child, oh dear. And not even properly mended. Look at the hem, my dear, look." Eliza did not turn. She listened to the whispers the way one listens to weather one cannot prevent. She had expected them. She had inventoried them in advance, and now that they had arrived, they were almost a relief, because the worst thing about a dreaded sound is the wait for it. Behind her, her aunt drew a slow breath that meant her aunt had also heard. Her aunt did not turn either. They stood, the two of them, like 2 birds on a wire, very still, and the whispers passed under them and went on to other prey. It was at that moment that the room performed the small alteration in its pitch a second time, and Eliza, who had been counting the panes of the window because there was nothing else safe to count, lifted her eyes. A man had come in by the far door. He was not tall in the way that draws comment. He was tall in the way that arranges a room around itself without seeming to try, and the arrangement happened before he had taken 3 steps. The music did not stop. The dancing had not yet begun, only the small preliminary movement of pairs finding each other along the edges. And yet there was a hush around him as he walked, as if the air made a path for him out of habit. He was perhaps 30. He had a face that did not, as her aunt had warned, intend to make itself agreeable, and yet it was not unkind. It was a face that had decided, some time ago and for reasons it did not intend to share, that the chief business of a face was to keep its own counsel. His coat was dark. His linen was very white. He carried, in the angle of his shoulders, the particular composure of a man who knew exactly how many people were looking at him and had resolved, at some private cost, not to be moved by the count. He spoke to the hostess. He spoke to 2 older gentlemen who had risen to greet him. He bowed to a dowager in green who held out her hand to him as if presenting a small treasure, and the bow he gave her was beautiful, the slow, exact bow of a man taught from childhood that courtesy is a form of armor. Then he straightened, and his eyes went over the room, and for one long second, the kind of second that is not measured by clocks, his eyes stopped on the tall window where Eliza stood beside her aunt in a cream silk dress that had been worn twice before, and Eliza, who had spent her whole life believing herself to be a person who was not seen, understood that she had been seen. She looked away. It was the only thing to do. She looked at the cornice. She counted, in a kind of inward whisper, the number of times the gold leaf made its little curl along the plaster, and she got to 11 and lost count, and began again, and got to 7, and stopped. Beside her, her aunt had gone very still in a different way. Her aunt's stillness had the quality of a hand laid carefully over a teacup that was about to spill. He was crossing the room. He was crossing it slowly, with that same arrangement of the air around him, and people parted for him as if they had practiced. He stopped, briefly, to acknowledge a man who appeared determined to be acknowledged, and then he moved on, and Eliza understood, with the clear, cold understanding that comes a moment before something one is not prepared for, that he was crossing the room toward her. He arrived. He bowed. The bow was the same beautiful bow he had given the dowager in green, neither shorter nor longer, neither colder nor warmer, and Eliza understood that this evenness was, in him, a form of fierce respect. He said her name. He said it in full, the name she had been announced with at the door, and he said it as if it were a name worth saying carefully, and he asked whether she would do him the honor of opening the dancing with him. Her aunt made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a kettle makes in the second before it boils, and Eliza did not look at her aunt, because to look at her aunt would have undone something she could not afford to undo, and instead Eliza inclined her head, the same small inclination she had given her aunt at the foot of the stairs, and she said, "The honor would be mine." She said it evenly. She heard her own voice, as if from a small distance, and was surprised to find that it had not shaken. He offered his arm. She laid her gloved hand on it. The gloves were a half size too large. The kid had yellowed at the fingertips. The cuff of her sleeve, at the inside of her left wrist, was mended with a stitch that she had given up trying to make invisible. He did not look at any of it. He looked, instead, at her face, briefly, with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided in advance that he will not let anyone in the room read what he is about to do. And he led her into the open space at the center of the floor where the dancers were to gather, and the room, which had not stopped speaking, lowered its voice by a fraction so as to listen. The musicians waited. He turned to face her. He inclined his head, and she inclined hers, and the first long phrase of the music began, and they began with it, and Eliza, who had practiced the figures of this particular dance in the back kitchen of her aunt's house, with a chair for a partner and a broom propped in the corner, found that her feet remembered what her mind had almost forgotten. She moved. He moved. They met in the middle of the figure and parted again, and his hand, when it found hers in the turn, was warm through the kid of her glove, and steady. He did not speak. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the room would not overhear, and they both, she understood, knew this. When the figure brought them close together for the second time, he said, quietly, only to her, "You are the calmest person in this room." She did not know what to do with the sentence. She felt it land somewhere small and private inside her, in the place where her mother's 2 nights were folded. And she looked up at him for the first time at full height and at full attention, and she said, just as quietly, "I am only practiced at it." He almost smiled. The almost smile did not arrive on his mouth. It arrived in the corner of his eye very briefly and was gone again. and the figure carried them apart, and she carried the almost smile with her into the next turn the way one carries a small lit candle through a dark hall, cupping a hand around it so the draft will not put it out. The dance ended. He bowed. She curtsied. She expected him to lead her back to her aunt at the window, because that was what one did. That was the shape of the evening. The dance was a single, courteous act, and after it the world resumed. He did not lead her back. He turned instead to the musicians and he said something low to the leader, who nodded, and a new piece began, and he turned to her again and asked, with the same beautiful evenness, whether she would dance the next. She said yes. She did not look at her aunt. She did not look at the dowager in green or at the cluster of older women at the window, or at any of the girls in their new gowns who were standing very still along the walls, with their fans held at the angle that meant they were no longer breathing quite as they had been. She looked at him. She had decided, somewhere between the first figure and the second, that for the length of this music, she would look at him as if there were no one else in the room, because there was, in fact, no one else in the room who was looking at her the way he was looking at her. And she had been polite to absences for a long time, and was tired of it. He danced the second with her. He danced the third with her. When the third ended and a young man in a blue coat detached himself from the wall and began, very visibly, to compose his courage to approach, the Duke turned his head only a fraction, and the young man in the blue coat reconsidered his courage and stepped back into the wall as if into a curtain. Eliza saw it. She did not, on her face, allow herself to see it. Inside, she noted it, and added it carefully to the small private ledger she kept of things she had not expected. He led her to a chair only once in the middle of the evening, when she said she would like a moment, and he brought her himself a glass of something pale and cold that tasted of lemons and of a fruit she did not know, and he stood beside her chair while she drank it, not bending over her, not making of his standing there any particular display, only standing, the way a tree stands at the edge of a field, present and unremarkable, and somehow changing the shape of the field by being there. He asked her, in that low voice he used only to her, whether she was enjoying herself. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions, and she said, "I am surprised by it." He inclined his head as if she had said something he had been waiting to hear, and he did not press. He did not ask why she was surprised. He did not ask whose dress she wore, although she felt, with the certainty one feels about such things, that he had seen the dress for what it was within the first minute and had set the scene aside, the way she set so many things aside, into a private ledger of his own. They danced again. They danced the supper dance. He took her into supper. He sat beside her at a long table where the silver was heavy and the glasses were thin as paper, and her aunt was placed, by some quiet rearrangement, 3 seats further along, between a deaf gentleman and a woman who spoke only of dogs, and her aunt did not know whether to be furious or triumphant, and so was, alternately, both. Eliza ate very little. She had been taught, by the long arithmetic of poverty, to eat in company as if eating were a small polite gesture rather than a need, and she made the small polite gestures. And the Duke noticed, she thought, and did not comment, and instead spoke to her, quietly, of small ordinary things. He asked whether she rode. She said she had, once. He asked whether she read. She said she did, more than was probably wise. He asked what, and she told him, and he listened, and when she had finished he named, without flourish, 2 books she had not read, and said he thought she would like them, and she understood that he had not been making conversation, he had been listening. It was the listening that undid her in the small private place where the candle was cupped. She had been listened to before, by her mother, and by no one else of consequence, and the experience of being listened to by a stranger was so foreign that she felt, for a moment, almost angry, the helpless anger of a person handed a thing she has wanted for so long that the wanting has become its own shape inside her, and the thing itself no longer fits. She set the anger aside. She added it to the ledger. She lifted her glass and drank, and the cold, pale drink with the unfamiliar fruit in it tasted, suddenly, like the beginning of a sentence she had not yet learned how to finish. After supper, there were more dances. He danced them all with her. He did not ask another woman. He did not pretend to consider asking another woman. He did not perform the small courtesies that men in his position were expected to perform on such an evening, the obligatory turn with the hostess's eldest daughter, the obligatory turn with the cousin from town, the obligatory turn with the dowager in green, who watched him now from her chair with an expression that was no longer a presentation of a small treasure, but a steady, narrowed assessment, the assessment of a woman who had known him since he was a boy and was slowly arriving at a conclusion. He did not see the dowager's assessment, or rather, he saw it, and he set it aside, and he asked Eliza whether she would dance the next, and she said yes. The whispers had altered. They had not stopped. Whispers in such rooms do not stop, but their pitch had changed. The first whispers, about the sleeve and the hem and the bodice that had not been new these 20 years, had given way to a second set, more careful, more uncertain, and underneath the second set there ran a thin, bright thread of a third. The thread that runs through any such room when the unexpected has been allowed to happen for longer than the room knows how to account for. Who is she? Who is she really? Whose was the dress? Whose was the mother? What does he know that we do not? Eliza heard the thread. She did not pull on it. She danced. Toward the end of the evening, when the candles had burned down by a third, and the air in the great room had grown warm with the breath of so many people and the slow heat of so much wax, he led her, between dances, to the long windows at the side of the hall that gave onto a stone terrace, and he asked whether she would care to take the air. She said she would. They stepped out together, and the night met them with the small kind shock of cool air on a warm face, and she breathed in the smell of cut grass and of late roses and of the river that ran somewhere beyond the lawn. And she felt the dress settle against her, the silk cooling, and she felt her mother near her in a way she had not felt for a long time, not as a presence, exactly, but as a kind of permission. They stood at the balustrade. He did not speak for a long moment. When he spoke, it was without looking at her, his eyes on the dark line where the lawn became the trees, and he said, "I owe you an explanation." She said, "You owe me nothing." He almost smiled again, that brief almost smile at the corner of the eye, and he said, "All the same." He paused. He set his hand on the cool stone of the balustrade and looked at his own hand as if it might tell him how to begin, and then he said, quietly, "I knew your mother." She did not turn to him. She kept her eyes on the dark line of the trees, because to turn to him then would have been to let something out of her that she could not have called back, and she said, evenly, "You did not know my mother." He said, "I did. I was a boy. I was 11 years old. She was kind to me at a moment when no one else in a particular house was kind to me, and I have not forgotten it. And I would not have forgotten it had I lived to be 100. I recognized the dress. I recognized it the moment you came through the door." He paused again. He said, "I did not dance with you because of the dress. I danced with you because of your face, which is not your mother's face, and is your own. The dress only told me where to look. She did not speak. She could not. Immediately, she stood with her gloved hands on the cool stone and felt the small private place inside her, the place where the candle was cupped, grow warm in a way she had not known it could grow warm, and the warmth spread outward, slow and astonishing, the way a fire takes a long dry log, and she understood that she was not going to cry, because she had been trained out of crying years ago, but that something in her was, very quietly, breaking. And that it was breaking in the right direction, toward and not away. She said, "At last, what was the kindness?" He said, "She gave me an apple." He said it as if he knew how small it sounded and did not care. He said, "I had been sent to bed without supper, for a fault that was not mine, and I was 11, and I was hungry, and she came up the back stair with an apple in her apron, and she sat on the edge of my bed, and she did not say anything sentimental. She only said, 'Eat this, and do not let anyone hear you,' and she stayed until I had finished, and then she took the core away in her apron so that there should be no evidence." He paused. He said, "I have eaten a great many fine things since. I have not eaten anything finer than that apple, and I have remembered all my life that there are people in the world whose kindness is exact and quiet and does not require to be repaid, and I have tried in my own way to be such a person, and I have not always succeeded." She closed her eyes. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. After a moment she said, "She did not tell me." He said, "She would not have. That was the shape of the kindness." He said, "I learned only last year, when I came into this house, that her daughter lived in this parish, and I did not know how to come to you, because I did not know what you would want from a stranger with an old debt, and I had decided, foolishly, to wait until chance arranged it. And then your name was given at the door, and I saw the dress, and I understood that chance had run out of patience with me, and I went across the room." She opened her eyes. She looked at him then, fully, for the second time that evening, and she found that the careful neutrality he had worn all night had thinned a little at the edges, and that underneath it there was a man who was, himself, not entirely certain what he had just done, and was prepared, if she required it, to be told that he had done wrong. She said, "You did not do wrong." She said it quietly, with the small, even certainty she used for the things that mattered most. She said, "You have given me back a piece of her I did not have." She paused. She said, "That is not a small thing." He bowed his head, slightly, the way he had bowed to the dowager in green, the bow of a man for whom courtesy was a form of armor, and she understood, with a small surprised tenderness, that he was using the armor now to keep himself steady. They stood at the balustrade a moment longer. Behind them, in the great room, the music had begun again, a slow piece, the last but one of the evening. He turned to her. He offered his arm. He said, "Will you dance the last with me?" She said yes. They went in together. He danced the last with her. He led her, at the end of it, not to the chair beside her aunt at the window, but to the hostess herself, and he made her known to the hostess, by name, slowly, and with a small particular weight on the name, and the hostess, who had been watching the whole evening with an expression that had moved by degrees from polite curiosity to private revision, took Eliza's gloved hand in both of hers and said, in the warm public voice of a woman correcting, in front of a watching room, an earlier and unspoken misjudgment, "My dear, you must come to me on Thursday. You must come for the whole of the day. I will not hear no." Eliza inclined her head. She said, "You are very kind." Her aunt, from the window, had gone the particular color that her aunt went when she did not yet know whether to be furious or triumphant, and so was, alternately both, the carriages were called. Cloaks were brought. In the corridor of paintings of horses and of men who had owned horses, the Duke walked beside Eliza one last time, not touching her, only walking, and at the door he bowed to her, the same beautiful, even bow, and he said, "Quietly, only to her, I will call." She said, "You will be welcome." She said it without flourish, in her even small voice, and he heard, she thought, everything that the smallness contained, and he straightened, and he stepped back, and he let her go. In the carriage on the way home, her aunt did not speak for a full mile. When her aunt finally spoke, it was in a voice that had been stripped of its earlier acid and had not yet found a new flavor to replace it, and her aunt said, "Child, what in heaven's name?" Eliza, looking out at the hedges that had stopped looking like crouching animals and had begun, in the moonlight, to look only like hedges, said, "He knew my mother." Her aunt was quiet for a long time. Then her aunt said, in a tone that was almost gentle, "Your mother was a remarkable woman, and we did none of us, perhaps, treat her quite as we ought." Eliza did not answer. She laid her gloved hand against the inside of her left wrist, against the small mended seam there, and she pressed it lightly, the way her mother used to do. The weeks that followed were quieter than the night had been, in the way that mornings are quieter than the storms they follow. The Duke called. He called on the Tuesday. He called on the Friday. He called the Tuesday after that, and the Friday after that, and by the third week, the parish had given up the small mathematics of pretending not to notice, and had moved on to the larger mathematics of revising its earlier opinions, which it did with the brisk practical efficiency of any small society faced with a fact it cannot deny. The Dowager in Green sent a note. The hostess of the ball, true to her word, claimed Eliza for a whole Thursday, and then for a whole Sunday, and then for a standing invitation. 3 girls who had stood very still along the wall with their fans at a particular angle now smiled. In the lane, when Eliza passed, and Eliza smiled back, because she had decided, some time during the third dance, that she would not carry a ledger of slights into the rest of her life if she could help it. The ledger of things she had decided not to think about had grown long enough already, and she meant, from now on, to keep a different sort of book. He asked her, in the early autumn, on a walk along the river at the bottom of his lawn, whether she would consider, in time, becoming his wife. He asked it without ornament, with the same evenness he had used to ask her to open the dancing, and she answered with the same evenness that she would. He took her hand. He did not kiss it. He only held it for a moment in his own, and looked at the water, and she looked with him, and the water went on past them, indifferent and knowing, the way water does. They were married in the spring, in the small parish church, quietly, with the Dowager in Green in the front pew, and the hostess of the ball beside her, and Eliza's aunt, in a new bonnet she had been saving for an occasion she had never quite believed would come. Eliza wore a new gown, made for her, but she carried, folded in a small lined case in the carriage that brought her to the church, the cream silk dress that had been her mother's, because she had decided that some things one does not wear again and does not put away, but keeps close at hand as one keeps the letters one loves. The aunt, it should be said, became, in the years that followed, an authority on the evening of the ball. She had been there. She had been the only one of her family present. She had, she said, known at once that something extraordinary was unfolding, and had given, she said, her quiet encouragement at the crucial moment. No one contradicted her. The Dowager in Green, who lived to a great age and grew sharper-tongued as she went, once remarked, at a dinner from which the aunt was absent, that the aunt's memory of that night was the most beautifully embroidered piece of work she had ever seen out of a workbox, and that she was inclined, all things considered, to admire it. The hostess of the ball, in her old age, kept a small painting in her morning room of a young woman in a cream silk dress, said to have been done from memory by a guest who had been present, and she would point it out to visitors and say, "That was the night I learned to be careful whom I underestimated," and she would say it with the air of a woman repeating a lesson she had set herself, faithfully, every morning since. The young man in the blue coat married, in due course, a sensible woman with a comfortable fortune and a great fondness for him, and was, by all accounts, happy, and never quite told his wife the full story of the night he had reconsidered his courage at a single turn of a stranger's head. And Eliza, in her own house, in the long room that gave onto the lawn, on a winter evening some years later, sat by a fire with a small child asleep against her shoulder, and the cream silk dress folded once again in its lined case on a shelf above her writing table, and she watched the flames find and lose and find again the shapes they made in the grate. And she thought of an apple carried up a back stair in an apron, and of a mended seam at the inside of a sleeve, and of a man who had crossed a room without hurrying, and she understood that she had been seen, once, on a single evening of her life, by someone who had known how to look. And that being seen once, truly, by one person is enough to make a life out of. The fire shifted. The child breathed. She laid her hand against the small warm back of the child and closed her eyes, and she let the silence hold. And here, by our own fire, you and I, we let the silence hold a little longer with her. If you have ever walked into a room in clothes you were afraid would betray you, if you have ever stood very still beside a window and counted the panes because there was nothing else safe to count, if you have ever carried, mended, and folded, and brave, some small piece of someone you loved, and lost into a place where you were not certain you would be welcome, then you already know what Eliza knew at the balustrade. You know that the people who matter are the ones who see the dress and set the seeing aside, and look, instead, at your face. You know that kindness given quietly, with no expectation of return, can travel a great distance and a great many years and find you again on an evening you did not expect. You know, perhaps, that being overlooked for a long time does not mean you will be overlooked forever, and that sometimes the room you have been standing at the edge of has only been waiting, without knowing it, for the right pair of eyes to cross it. So tell me, as the fire burns low between us tonight, which moment stayed with you? Was it the small click of the clasp at the back of her neck in the attic room, when she counted 1, 2, 3? Was it the almost smile at the corner of his eye, in the first turn of the first figure, when she said she was only practiced at it? Was it the apple in the apron on the back stair, all those years ago, that neither of them had been alive to witness together, and that both of them, in their separate ways, had been carrying ever since? Sit with it a moment. Let it settle. There is no hurry here, and if you have found, in the warmth of this telling, the kind of quiet you came looking for, then pull your chair a little closer for the next one. There will be another story by this fire soon, and another after that, and another after that, each one for someone who has been waiting, as Eliza waited, to be seen. Stay with us, keep the seat beside you free. The kettle is on, the lamp is trimmed, and the night, as you can hear, is still long. Until the next story, then, sleep gently, travel softly, and be kind in the exact, quiet way that lasts.